wait a minute, you're saying that if you go to Congress with what you want to do, which they end up doing in secret anyways, they're going to say no. I'm saying, why would they say no? Well, because I was going to basically set aside the Fourth Amendment. Exigent conditions. That's what I was told. Exigent conditions apply.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
I know we're going to be talking about the NSA. I think there are substantial misconceptions about what the NSA is, what they were formed to do, their operational role in our intelligence umbrella. So before we talk about how you ended up there, can you unpack from your understanding, why does the NSA exist? What was the objective in creating it? What is their primary role? Maybe we'll just start there with a pin in it.
We have to go back to the early years of the Cold War.
Okay.
Post-World War II. NSA was just literally created by the stroke of a pen. Harry S. Truman, 1952 in the fall. It was not legislation. It was not part of the National Security Act in 1947, which is one of the common misconceptions. So, and it was also a secret signing, way off the books. It was never made public at the time. In fact, the joke with NSA for decades until the 70s, when there was a number of quote unquote surveillance spy scandals, right? That all came out with certain commissions and investigations. No such agency, never say anything. So with that, it was created because it was clear, again, lessons from World War II, that we needed an intelligence agency that focused on electronic communications. And it was formed under the umbrella of an expanded Department of Defense. It's been headed up by a general. Originally, it was 2/3-star. Then it was for decades a 3-star. And then post 9/11, a few years after 9/11, it became a 4-star position. And it basically rotates effectively every 4 to 6 years, although that has varied depending on who is occupying the directorship. So that's in summary.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Communications intelligence is really the focus. And it's also important to note that its original mission was outward facing. We're talking foreign intelligence.
That's what I was going to ask, which was by
foreign intelligence, had a very broad mission. And when you're talking about communications, that's both, signals intelligence, electronic intelligence. So the sort of the combination of those two make up communications.
And I don't want
machine level, obviously encryption of all kinds, machine to machine communications, as well as, I'll just use the phrase, push to talk, human to human.
Yeah. I think it's important for the listeners, even though in your description, it's very simple. It's, supposed to be outward facing. I think that needs to be underlined and highlighted, because that is, to me, at least as a citizen who never really interfaced with the NSA or really understood what it is that they were doing, it was my understanding that it was a radar dish facing outward. And I think a lot of problems started occurring when that radar dish started to be oriented inward. So I think it's just important to put a pin in that for the listener as well. That's one of the main, I personally believe, tipping points that brought a lot of, how should we say, attention that they probably didn't want to that particular organization.
Well, historical irony, even prior to 9/11 and still during the Cold War, was in the 1970s, it came out that NSA had been in secret, been the executive branch approval in secret spying on Americans without warrants. And that was even with a warrant, you weren't supposed to be even spying on Americans at all, right? Quote unquote, inward facing. That was not the job of NSA. It was not. But the other thing to say, when you say outward facing, it was carte blanche. But you remember, that's the analog era. This is before the digital era.
Yep.
It was usually hard targets. The in terms of electromagnetic spectrum, which is quite large. There was a lot of focus on systems that were harder to reach, and that's what its forte was. It was, remember, in its Cold War, bipolar, great powers, us versus them, Western civilization versus communism. I mean, in some ways, it was kind of that black and white in terms of, obviously, there's a lot of proxies involved, but again, all the history. But foreign intelligence gave it broad swath, and so there really wasn't any limit in terms of what it could collect.
On the new episode of Black Project, a Change Agents special series, we do a deep dive into the world of special access programs and the secretive work being done by the likes of Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works division, DARPA, and aerospace contractors. Have they developed UFO technology? Become an Ironclad YouTube member to binge all 4 episodes of Change Agents Black Project on launch day. Otherwise, catch new episodes weekly. Join now, YouTube at This Is Ironclad. You've said before that you believe the NSA's failure to prevent 9/11 was the result of a poor implication of technology and not using a software called ThinThread. Can you talk about what ThinThread is and how it's supposed to work?
Yeah, it's one part of it. It's just that you have to realize the larger collection system was oriented much more differently. It was optimized for the analog world, right?
Yeah.
It was not optimized for the digital world. So their answer was, we'll just collect everything, try to figure it all out later. And we're even 24 years or 25 years ago. And remember, this problem was well known. There was a whole series of studies in the 90s. There was formal reports that were being issued, Rand Corporation and others, right? Both the organizational level in terms of how do you organize for the digital age, but also just the technology. NSA basically, the not invented here syndrome. In fact, I used to hear, even when I was there, it's like, well, there's no secrets worth knowing on internet, not realizing that internet was increasingly this is sort of the arrogance, the institutional arrogance.
Well, I'm also laughing with 20 plus years of rear view mirror looking at what the internet has become. So yeah, let's just say that person's comment was on the wrong side of history.
Oh yeah, no. And then that was, a huge, sort of like the wake up call on 9/11. But so the technology, yeah, you could collect it all, but then you're increasingly, you could say there's 2 ways to look at this. You could say the more you collect, the less you know, or you know less and less, okay, about less. Okay. So it was, no matter which way you looked at it, the analytics side of this and the reporting was just completely broken, because how do you make sense of all this, right? How do you figure out, obviously you can't suck the ocean dry, or as I've said in the past, you can't take all the sand off the beach and then sift through it, because there's just too many grains of sand. In fact, you're actually violating sort of the fundamental tenets of even intelligence, right? Because you break it all up. You take everything out of context. So they just said, we'll collect it all, figure it out later. And the technology basically was, at the time, well, we have relational databases. We'll just dump everything to these databases, and then we'll start, sort of Rube Goldberg queries after the fact to sort of sort through it all, because we can't, except for like super high value targets, which some were still sort of the traditional legacy systems. We'll figure it all out later. The problem was it became just overwhelming. In essence, NSA was going deaf, right? Almost in a literal sense. All the data is there, but so much of it was just ending up in the databases without anybody knowing what was in there, except in a very, very narrow regard. So technology, this again, NSA every year, when I was there, even as a contractor prior to becoming a senior executive, every year they would have their top 5 challenge problems. And one of the challenge problems was, how do you handle all this digital data, this vast amount, or data is being converted and dumped into these databases? This was not an unknown issue, right? The question was, how do you tackle it?
Mm-hmm.
And there was what I'll call skunkworks equivalent. These are very small, very agile teams. I got to know them extremely well. And one of them, it was called the SARC. It was a SIGINT Analysis Research Center. We're talking about 18 people, mostly government, but there was a few contractors. And over iterative development, but very rapid, had developed a system that could have gone operational well before 9/11, but was never given that opportunity. And it looked at it completely differently. It said, you don't need to, quote unquote, suck, the ether of all the signals. You only have to focus on the stuff that matters. And you have to just sort through those things that matter and leave everything else in place. You don't have to bring everything back. That had been the history, was just we bring everything back. But see, in the old days, there wasn't that much, relatively speaking, that you were bringing back.
Yeah.
Not in the digital age. ThinThread was an extraordinary system. I ended up, after the core leads, the government leads left or retired early in October of 2001, I took over the program as the executive lead. And then we further iterated it. But we were never allowed. This is one of the tragedies. It's one of the unspoken parts of the history. It was never allowed to go operational.
Why is that?
Because it conflicted with the institutional choice to say, we're going to buy the solution. And this was a decision made at the highest levels, up to and including the then director, Michael V. Hayden. We're going to buy the solution from, and I'll just use the phrase, it's attributed to Dwight D. Eisenhower during his famous or infamous farewell address in January of 1961, where he warned about the rise in the military-industrial complex. And sure enough, here it was, we're just going to spend umpteen billions. And this had already been let out prior to 9/11, but nothing had really come forward except, some prototype stuff, which is mostly, we're talking just basically demos of what was, basically concepts, right, of an actual operational program. And we're going to spend all these billions to buy it instead of making it. NSA, to its credit, historically, with some contractors, had usually built their systems. They didn't go out and buy them. But this was a decision that was made. And sort of in Hayden, you can understand in some ways, well, that it's a huge problem, this data problem. It's so huge. How do we deal with the digital age? This is like the equivalent of the Manhattan Project when it comes to digital data. We need to have the same kind of money being spent to, quote unquote, solve it, as if spending all this money was solution. Historically, it never was. I had already been on programs when, in fact, some years earlier on the largest automated data processing system, there was also an utter failure called Minstrel, right? NSA should have learned its lessons. Well, this small, agile organization ended up solving the challenge problem, but it was rejected because it conflicted with decisions made at the highest levels. So and there's a long story behind this with me. This is early 2002. We actually turned the system. We weren't allowed to go operational, unfortunately. And there was critical counterterrorism sites, classified, most of them, in which this system, ThinThread, and other components could have been deployed and put into immediate use. And remember, this system was ready to go well prior to 9/11. So I was able to convince the number 3, at that time, my supervisor, well, why don't we just turn it on the main collection databases which we're talking multiple terabytes of data. We found all kinds of things, but because of what we found, both pre 9/11 and post 9/11, in terms of counterterrorism, it was such an embarrassment that they said, we can't let this be known, right? That we had huge amounts of data that could have been provided, the analysis of it provided to decision makers to have blunt stopped or even prevented 9/11. So a cover-up. was quickly employed to prevent the knowledge of this from getting out. I call it a cover-up, right? And the whole program was shut down. And again, the Indiana Jones warehouse, it was simply parked, never to be seen again. The irony, of course, is that there was a secret, super secret system, much more compartmented than even SCI, extensive compartmented information. It was at the ECI level. And it was employed. It's called Stellar Wind, right after 9/11. It was secretly authorized at the highest levels. Cheney was really sort of the national security. He had that part of the portfolio that was given him by Bush. And this particular program took parts of ThinThread, stripped out all the protections for U.S. persons. Remember, this is under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, stripped all the protections and said, we're just going to collect it all. And it didn't matter where the data came from. This is really at the heart of my whistleblowing, although I blew the whistle on a number of things, including the 9/11 intelligence failures, and then the Trailblazer program, which is this multi-billion-dollar boondoggle. They stripped out all the privacy protections and just said, we're just going to collect it all. That became the answer. The answer was the failure was an excuse to simply collect it all.
Ladies and gentlemen, hot salt from Firecracker Farm is the real deal. It's not just heat, it's flavor that elevates everything that you cook. The best thing to happen to food since fire. That's a bold statement, but I'm going to go ahead and agree with that. It's delightful. One of the best things about this brand is there's a real person behind it. His name is Alex, and he makes these in small batches, so it's not always easy to get. You don't want to miss out. All of the flavors are great. I have tried all of them. You really can't go wrong. Seriously, try it on everything. Steaks, vegetables, everything in between. I love cooking. I like cooking at home. I don't like putting sauces and overbearing things on the things that I cook, so I tried a little bit of the salt. And if I'm being honest, I tried a little bit too much the first time. It was a little spicy. So I had to back it off a little bit, and it made everything that I cook at home taste better. So it's an easy addition to the things that I already make. It tasted amazing. I was using the product for well over 6 months before Alex reached out to present as the sponsor for Change Agents. Easy peasy. I was already doing it. No additional time. A touch point with it in my personal life. I could talk about it from personal experience. Love what the brand stands for. Love what the brand was founded around. Enjoy the person who founded the brand. I mean, this is a match made in heaven. Get out of the comfort zone of what you can get in the grocery store. Go online to Firecracker Farm and use the code Ironclad for 15% off of your first order. You're going to be shocked at how much more of a flavor it brings out in what you cook. Isn't Stellar Wind part of the programs that Snowden whistleblew on as well? Or am I
yes, although the name, if it's changed, the names, that's one of the classic ways you keep things sort of even over oversight committees from like figuring out where things are or where the money's being spent.
You just cycle through different names,
Or you hide it because ECI, in some ways, you're hiding if SAP SAR programs, which I was very familiar with from the military. You end up using SAP SAR and sort of what we call the red zones. And in behind the red zone, you have this other compartment, right, that protects your most sensitive or the ones you don't want anybody to know about. That's how they protected this. But there's the abject violation of the Constitution, Fourth Amendment, and a number of other standing statutes, FISA for one, and other regulations. And it's for me, and this I'm just going to, because for me it's a burden that I carry for the rest of my life. It's the what ifs of history. It never should have happened. I mean, it just shouldn't have. And there's a whole series of events behind all this. I'm giving you just sort of the highlights to sort of summarize just the tragedy. It's really a tragedy in what happened. Even despite the failure, the U.S. still had a huge opportunity to like take the lessons learned and put them into play. But it became this equity, as they call it, battle, and we're not going to blame anybody. We're going to have investigations, but there's going to be no accountability. And meanwhile, they keep spending. This became the thing. I remember hearing this from my supervisor, like 9/11 was a gift to NSA. We're going to get all the money and then some. It's like, wow, wait a minute. Don't you have this fundamental under the Constitution, the preamble, there's this whole thing about providing for the common defense, right? And we were part of providing for the common defense. The two main, the other one is promoting the general welfare of the people. Provide the common defense. We failed, right? We utterly failed. Well, okay, let's learn lessons. One way to do that was to put into operational, deployment, deploy and put it into the fight. They wouldn't allow the very best of NA, the very best of the, famous, necessity is the mother of invention. NSA shut all that down. It's unfortunate. And then you can imagine, this is, now you're getting to the heart of what I was facing as a senior executive with a long history in intelligence. I'd taken an oath for the 5th time at this point, twice in the Air Force. So it was for the 5th time to support and defend the Constitution. And I'm finding myself defending the Constitution against my own government. And there's the whole series of events that took place where I was confronting my own supervisor and even the lead general counsel for this program. There were very few people were read in. I was never read into it. But he was, and he said, "You don't understand, Mr. Drake. We just need the data."
Yeah, at what cost? Can you?
No, well, see, that's now you get into like blowback.
Yeah.
Remember, you get into blow. What cost? The cost was huge because I knew this was going to have huge downstream effects. It would eventually come out. It didn't matter how secret they made the Stellar Wind program, which was part of the president said, P.S., the president's failed. But when it first came out publicly, right, I was blowing the whistle internally for quite a while about all this, including back channel, even it was authorized to the intelligence committees. Like, wait a minute. And I even said, at the time, it's like when I was doing my confrontation, it's like, if FISA, which had been modified a number of times, 5 times from 78 to pre 9/11 to keep up with the time. You think, oh no, it's outdated. You can't keep up. Blah blah blah. It's too long. You got to do this whole affidavit thing. No, you didn't have. If the laws aren't meeting the needs, then you go back to Congress, and at that time, just about anything could have been passed. It turned out the Patriot Act was passed a couple months later, and then secretly interpreted. Right. So, if the laws are not sufficient for the day, given the national security crisis we faced, and not knowing, where all the threats were, right? At one point, some of the hijackers were basically staying in hotels in Laurel, Maryland, just down the street from NSA, practically in the shadows, right? Practically in the shadows of the main building complex. So, if the laws aren't meeting the needs of national security, you go back to Congress to change law. And I said, no, if what we would want, they're going to say no. And you can imagine the hair was going up on the back of them. I said, wait a minute, you're saying that if you go to Congress with what you want to do, which they end up doing in secret anyways, they're going to say no. I'm saying, why would they say no? Well, because I was going to basically set aside the 4th Amendment. Exigent conditions. That's what I was told. Exigent conditions apply. It's an exception. An exception. The exception became a huge carve out for this secret program, inside of which they ended up treating. This is the interesting. Even maps. It's like anything that was that you said, but the radar outward facing, right? Anything was foreign was fair game. If it was U.S. persons, even overseas, there was all these protections. There was even hot pursuit, even under FISA. If the threat was that great at a U.S. person, right? This is part of what's been mixed up in all dialogue. Even this is my frustration, even to this day, with media is they don't really look at this closely enough and say, oh yeah, it's just all become politicized. Well, in part, it has become politicized, but part of the problem here is, wait a minute, let's go back to the fundamentals. Did you actually have to draw the line? See, this is part of what Hayden would do. He would basically draw. He had his sports examples, like with a tennis court. Well, we're going to be, kicking up the chalk dust. Except he went way outside the lines, right? Even for doubles. So to stretch that analogy a bit further.
Yeah.
They just wanted the data. It didn't matter where it came from. So in essence, it didn't matter if it was a U.S. person, if it got swept up in some massive collection. It didn't, there was no warrant, none of that. In fact, they bypassed even the special court that was set up, right? So I just shake my head. I mean, you can tell it's, even after all these years, just extraordinary, massive amount of money was spent, right? Just this is sort of the Pied Piper. It's like we're just going to keep dumping more and more money, and eventually, we'll be able to figure it out. They already had it figured out. That was the problem. This is the real. We had it figured out. It wasn't like it wasn't figured out. It was. The solution did exist. Solutions, but we were going to be constitutionally compliant, and in particular with the Fourth Amendment and the statute that was in FISA.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get into elite shape, or perhaps just make improvements to your current level of fitness, check out the Mountain Tough digital training program. You can try it for free for 14 days, and you can see the results for yourself. The app allows users to train wherever they are with minimal equipment requirements, whether you're in the gym or you're outdoors or you're at home. Users can access top-tier programming that fits into their lifestyle. The Mountain Tough app offers expertly designed progressive training plans that guide users from start to finish. These plans are tailored to build resilience, strength, and endurance over time, preventing burnout and injury. The app features self-guided and follow-along coaching videos, allowing users to be coached through every workout step by step. This helps to ensure proper form, motivation, and intensity, regardless of the user's fitness level. The Mountain Tough app delivers training programs built for the unique physical demands of mountain athletes, including hunters, tactical professionals, and outdoor adventurers. The programs themselves are designed by seasoned strength and conditioning experts, elite athletes, and military veterans. Start your 14-day free trial today and check out the results for yourself. And be sure to use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS, and I'm looking at it as one word, at sign-up, and you can get 40% off your annual subscription. Remember, use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS at checkout. How did your efforts to whistleblow on these programs end up with you being charged with espionage?
Wow, that's really at the center of how I become what I call an asterisk American. Okay, there's always been an asterisk next to my name because I was charged under the Espionage Act, which essentially is only really supposed to be used, against real spies. And here I was, just still surreal. But so I decided, right after 9/11, I couldn't remain silent because I'd be complicit in a crime. What's the crime? The crime is my own government's violating the Constitution. So I could not remain silent. I mean, this is where I exercise, more moral agency, but it was also, I wasn't going to violate the oath. How do you hold, that allegiance, good faith and allegiance to the very oath that I had taken, right? I mean, to me, the Constitution, for all of its flaws, and there's any number of flaws that were built in from the beginning, it still was what made us different. It's what made us America, right? As the United States of America. So I began to speak out very early on. And of course, I got tagged as someone that was going to cause problems. So a whole lot of retaliation, retribution started to occur quite quickly. I went to every channel that existed, all the formal channels for whistleblowing, also existing laws, Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, which allowed me at the time, they modified it later, I could go directly to the intelligence oversight committees, both the HPSC, the House Permanent, as well as Select. Again, that all came out of the scandals in the 1970s, which is when I grew up, I was a young teenager in high school. That was my civic awakening, that no one was above the law. And even in secret, you couldn't use national security and classified, right, as an excuse to cover and engage in activities that, quote unquote, broke the law, or use that as a way to get around the law. There was a number of investigations. I was a material witness, both with all kinds of documentation. This is where I was different than Snowden. I didn't bring out highly classified information. I kept it within channels. Mm-hmm. That went on for quite a while. The investigations ensued over a number of years. I won't go into all the details. We get to 2005. I had actually gone to the director, which was Keith Alexander, in November of 2005 with, you still have a chance to employ real solutions at work, but he rejected all that. He went with, because Trailblazers at that point had failed after multiple billions had been spent. So he went with a whole different program. That is the answer, which was still based on the same flawed foundations. And then the James Risen and Eric Lichtbau front page above the fold, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program. I can only tell you that when that came out in early December of 2005, the national security, especially NSA, but Bush and Cheney, went apoplectic.
Oh, I
and
bet.
you go back and apoplectic. They just like, oh my gosh, because it was one of the most secret programs that the national security and the government had. We're talking one of the most secret. It was more secret than the torture program, right? It was more secret than a number of. I was part of, right, and there was a huge national security complex. I became very aware of it, and I was read in on a number of interesting programs, right, to support national security. This was one of the most secret. And they quickly launched a massive leak investigation, a national security leak investigation. And I knew at that time, in December 2005, that I would be tagged, no doubt, as a probable source, if not the primary source, of that New York Times article and the two reporters who wrote it, even though I had never gone to the New York Times. And sure enough, I became a significant person of interest and was targeted over a couple of years. And I had gone in the meantime. I made a fateful decision. I own it, but I made the choice. I knew, because of what happened to Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, the bright and shining lie of Vietnam, which that's a whole nother historical failure. I knew that if I went to the press, there was more than a passing likelihood that I would lose my job, or worse, and be charged in a similar manner.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew an awful lot was at stake. And in essence, the fourth estate was sort of the last, you talk about touching the third rail. Yeah, going to the fourth estate's touching the third rail. There was going to be blowback for me. Long story in terms of how was I able to, she was being monitored. So this is another part of, there was the PSP was sort of the umbrella program, right? But NSA was the executive agent for it. At NSA, the secret program at the time, the surveillance regime, or you could call it bulk collection, so they preferred to call it to get around sort of mass surveillance, was Stellar Wind. But there was other, that was an umbrella, right? There was other programs. One of them actually targeted certain journalists, reporters, and media outlets because they were, in fact, quite afraid of unauthorized leaks regarding a number of things that the Bush administration had engaged in. They did not want the public to know about. So they were hiding a number of things away from the public interest. Now, are there legitimate secrets to keep? Yes, there are legitimate secrets, but those are very, very small in number, like nuclear codes and nuclear technology, things of that nature, troop movements, ship movements, things of in that category, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some kind of larger is certain critical elements of national defense. Yeah, you just don't want anybody, including the public, just knowing about it. And we even there's a whole system involved where you could actually release things that were unclassified that would still reflect, but would not reveal, as we would call it, and when I say we, the royal we, sources and methods. The one thing you always protected were sources and methods. So here I am, knowing I've been targeted. So you can imagine this is the spring of 2006. 1996, I had been in contact with the reporter anonymously. She didn't even know who I was for another year about all this, but with unclassified information. And I was put under electronic and physical surveillance. I would never want anybody to go through what I do. It reminded me of, going back to the Cold War and certain other regimes in other foreign lands that, end up monitoring their population. Here I was being directly targeted, and I had FBI agents following me around for quite a while, both surreptitiously as well as in later kind of in the open, and plus all kinds of electronic surveillance. You can imagine, here it is, end of November 2007. So this is almost, a year and a half plus later from the time I was targeted. I'm getting ready. At the time, I was teaching at the National Defense University down at Fort McNair, and I was getting ready for work. And I look out the window, and there's all these cars pulling up, and FBI agents streaming out across the front yard, and huge knock at the door, and they're about to bust in. My son opened the door, and they had a warrant. They actually had gone to a magistrate judge in Maryland to get a warrant, and they served it on me, and they rifled, basically turned the house inside out for the next 9 hours. It was the last time that I formally wanted. It was like, well, here's a chance. But they didn't want to hear about any of my whistleblowing. They didn't want to hear about the violation of law. They didn't want to hear about, up to and including the president. All they said is, we're here to collect evidence. And they took just about anything that looked like evidence, books, papers, pretty much everything electronic. There were some funny moments. My original days of computing began with 8-bit computers. Home computers. My first computer was an Atari 800, which I still enjoy going back to those days. And they're carrying out my old Atari computers. And I said, and I actually remember the guys coming up from my basement office, and I looked down at him as he's coming up. I said, "You really need to take that? That's technology goes back to the late 70s." And he actually looked down at it and said, "No, we don't." And he put it back on the shelf. It was just one of those moments.
How did it resolve itself? I mean, it looks like the full force of the government was thrown at you.
We're talking, it turned out, and this is an article in the New York Times in 2010, right? I haven't even, I just skipped ahead several years. So there was this multi-million-dollar 5 full-time prosecutors, 25 full-time agents. They were pulling FBI agents from their mole hunter unit, which is specifically trained to go after real spies, right? That's how serious they were about me. That's how the level of threat I allegedly posed for the government and causing we're not just talking regular damage, but the gravest of damage to the national security of the United States. That's the level at which I was targeted. Because of the New York Times article. So that was revealed in the New York Times in July of 2010. So what happened between November and then when I was formally indicted in April? So I was working for Apple. I mean, I ended up leaving. I resigned. It was clear they're going to permanently remove. They already suspended my clearance. They put me on administrative leave. And so in April of 2008, I'm behind several 8 balls. I end up resigning under a very dark cloud. And in April of 2010, I was formally indicted. I ended up hiring at extraordinary expense. We're talking $500 plus an hour and then some. A criminal defense attorney because it's like, wow, how am I going to do all this? Because I could end up in prison for many, many years, if not decades, just given how hell-bent the government was on not just making an example of me, but putting me away as punishment for having dared blow the whistle on a program. And it's still surreal when I say it this way, that I was being, it was criminal to expose or disclose crimes committed by the state, because in fact that became the crime. It was a crime against the state to reveal a state crime. I still shake my head to this day. So for the next 14 months, a combination of criminal defense attorneys, pro bono attorneys that went to bat for me, because I knew I'd have to influence the court of public opinion. Long story short, a whole series of things started to happen. I had public defenders because I was unable. My criminal defense attorney didn't want to go forward for the pretrial proceedings. He said, I'll help support it, and others declined because their law firm said, if you want to defend, even though they knew it was a huge First Amendment case, if you want to defend Mr. Drake, you're going to have to leave the law firm. And these are very high-powered law firms. So here I was with public defenders. I was declared indigent before the court because at this point I'd spent umpteen tens and tens of thousands of dollars on a private criminal defense attorney. I'm completely exposed. We're talking many, many years in prison, many. And I've skipped over a whole bunch of stuff in terms of what led up to that. Multiple attempts to get me to plead out to like 25 plus years, right, in prison for what I had done against the U.S. And so for the next 14 months, so we're talking between April and June. So on the day before, it's the scheduled day before, this is Thursday in June of 2011. This is after Jane Mayer's article came out in the New Yorker. I was then interviewed by Scott Pelley with 60 Minutes. I was awarded the Ridenhour Truth-Telling Prize, right, for my whistleblowing or truth-telling. On the very eve, the jury had already been selected, plus the alternates. And on the eve of the trial date, which was to be basically the formal selection of the jury, which was to begin on the Monday. So that's the Monday after the Thursday. During a break, there was a chance, came up at the last minute during the break, and all of a sudden an off-ramp appeared. And basically on my terms, I was able to plead out they dropped all, but it was on the condition, they had to drop all the 10 felony counts. Remember, I was facing many, many decades, felony count indictments, obstruction of justice, quote unquote, 4 counts for lying, which I was actually telling the truth, but they said I was lying to the FBI agents. And then 5 felony counts under the Espionage Act for quote unquote retaining for the purpose of disclosure, which wasn't even in the law, highly basically defense intelligence information. So I was able, no fine, no jail time, 240 hours of community service, 1 year probation. And I went free. And that's how I, quote unquote, escaped, right, from ending up in prison.
Thomas, I feel like we could talk about, I know that we're just scratching the surface. And I know I only have an hour with you. I have a hard out here in a few minutes as well. So 2 things. I'm going to talk to the producers. We definitely need to link up again for a longer episode so we can dive into it.
Sure.
I'm curious, and maybe the best way to close is, I know you're out of the intelligence game at this point, but given what you saw, given what you experienced, given how you saw the government and the entities inside of it act, what are your thoughts on likely the current state of surveillance against U.S. citizens from the U.S. government? What's your anecdotal temperature take of what's the current situation?
Anecdotal. Yeah. We know about the Snowden disclosures. I knew, even as I left in 2008, that the system, and of course, I'll just say it this way, had begun to fully metastasize, meaning it was not a one-off. It was not temporary. It was now part of the system. And so what happened, and this started prior to Obama, because remember, I was indicted under Obama, but the original investigations began under Bush. They began to pass laws to make legal what was patently illegal and unconstitutional. There's a famous quote from Kissinger about all that, right? So, anecdotally, because it's now normalized and now you got AI in the loop, it's just become this super surveillance system. And it's just, we collect massive amounts of data, and just about anything is available by hook or by crook, by buying. There's certain arrangements that were made with corporations, telecommunication concerns. There's Section 702, which is kind of a backdoor. They'll say it's not, but it really is. Yeah, and it's like, and then again, it's like if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to worry about. Well, okay, but then what happens to the Constitution? Is national security that much of an exception that we have to set aside sort of the fundamental thing that makes us different? I remember, you have to remember, this is like, what was the basis for even the United States? What led us to separate? And we're talking about very few, and they were, landed and tended to be more wealthy at the time, right? The ones that actually said, King George III, it's time for you to go by. We're going to form our own country. I've lived in, most of the states that were republics before they became states. That includes Texas and Vermont and California. And there's something unique to me still. Some say I'm naive, right? The thing that makes us America is America, but I still stand fast on that. It's the great experiment, and I still think it's worth keeping. And we don't have to. There is this line. There is really it's a false dichotomy. It's false choice to say you want liberty or security. Benjamin Franklin himself warned about that. You can actually have both.
I agree.
You don't need to compromise either one. You can actually have both. So the trend lines concern me, right? You hear about the deep state. I'm not in the deep state anymore. Even that's taken on sort of its own definition. But it is concerning. I mean, and there's a lot of just a democracy at large, even constitutional republic form of democracies, which is unique to America. Right? Other countries have in part patterned themselves, their constitutions after ours, is at risk. And I think there's still something worth keeping about what it really means to be an American.